Hello, my name is Catherine Kalaitis, and I'm the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Sebastian Matzner. Dr. Matzner is senior lecturer in comparative literature and director of Queer at King's at King's College London. His research focuses on the interaction between ancient and modern literature and thought, especially in the fields of poetic and rhetoric, literary and critical theory, the history of sexualities, and LGBTQ studies. He's published articles and books in these fields, too exhaustive to name here, and is the author of Rethinking Metonymy, Literary Theory and Poetic Practice, from Pindar to Jakobson. He's also the co-editor of Complex Inferiorities, the Poetics of the Weaker Voice in Latin Literature, and Metalepsis, Ancient Texts, New Perspectives. Dr. Matzner has also worked extensively on the history of German Philhellenism, which is the topic he'll be addressing in this video, where he provides a comprehensive history of German Philhellenism from the early modern period to the present. This fascinating history not only influenced the life and work of Alexander Mohr, but so many important figures in literature, art, music, and philosophy. I am very grateful to Dr. Matzner for agreeing to participate in this video, and I'm sure you will find him as interesting and engaging as I do. Enjoy!
I am Sebastian Matzner. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Comparative Literature at King's College London, and my research focuses on interactions between ancient and modern literature. When we think of German Philhellenism, we typically think of a period in the 18th century, roughly from 1772 to 1805, that is commonly known as Weimar Classicism, a high point in German literature and thought, with key figures including the authors Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Friedrich Schiller, and Christoph Wieland. It marks a high point of an obsession and passion for all things Greek in Germany, so intense that the scholar Eliza Marion Butler referred to it in her seminal book as, quote, the tyranny of Greece over Germany. But when and where does German Philhellenism begin? It is quite hard to pin this down. One important feature to note here about Germany in the context of other European cultures and countries is that it did not have as much and as pronounced a Renaissance period as the more southern countries had, notably Italy. Of course, there were important German humanists, but the kind of flourishing of new writing that we see in Italy with the turn to ancient Greece and ancient Roman literature and culture, the new discovery of new texts, we don't see quite as pronounced a flowering in German literature and culture. Instead, another major event takes the limelight here, and that is, of course, that of the Protestant Reformation. And this has implications for the future of German Philhellenism. Amongst his ecclesial reforms, Martin Luther also pushed for a better education in the German lands, for more schools to open to include both boys and girls, and they should focus in their training on classical languages. One of Luther's key collaborators, Philip Melanchthon, is known as the Praeceptor Germaniae, the teacher of Germany, and he has earned this title because he set up an entire new secondary education system in the German lands that took up the Protestant Reformation. And he also worked towards establishing a new training for the Protestant clergy that was needed in those territories, and where the local princes, dukes, and local potentates set up new places of study and instruction for this new clerical class. And they had to specialize in all three sacred languages. So this spread out across the German lands together with the Reformation, with all the little principalities, kingdoms, and duchies, each vying to train the best future ministers. And ministers here both in the sense of clergy, but also civil administration. So we have in the 16th century a rise in instruction, not only in Latin, but also in Greek across those territories. And we have important foundations that will play an important role later on in the 18th century when German Philhellenism, as it's typically understood, really comes to its own. Places to think of here might include the very famous Tübinger Stift, an educational foundation in the south of Germany, founded in the 16th century, where big figures of German Romanticism and Philhellenism, people like Hölderlin and Hegel, would go on to receive their training. So we see in this much earlier period, in the 16th century into the 17th century, a spread of teaching in classical languages, also in Greek. So we might say the soil was prepared, as it were, the seeds were sown, but it would take until the late 18th century and the early 19th century when German Philhellenism would really become a cultural force to reckon with. However, first, before Weimar classicism entered the stage, another classicism dominated the European literary and cultural scene, and that was French Neoclassicism. One key figure on the German side who mediates French Neoclassicism is Johann Christoph Gottsched, a literary theorist, critic, and a dramatist, and we can really credit him with introducing French 18th century classical standards of taste into the literature and theatre of the German-speaking lands. One of his famous works is the Versuch einer kritischen Dichtkunst vor die Deutschen, an essay on German critical poetic theory. It dates to 1730, and that was the first German treatise on the art of poetry according to the standards of reason and good taste advocated in France by thinkers like Nicolas Boileau, who was the foremost exponent of French neoclassicism, which very much looked towards Rome and Latin literature as being very akin to French language and literature, and trying to develop a new writing and a new aesthetics for France. And this is really where poetics and politics meet. Bear in mind, at this time, France is a powerful and united country and has been so for some time. We have a centralized state, we have a courtly culture, we have patronage for a lot of writers who have turned from the Renaissance on to ancient classical models, in particular Roman models, and there is a tendency to portray France as the new Rome, as imitating and surpassing Roman achievements in both politics, but also in poetry, in literature, in art, and in culture. So while France is a powerful and united country, the German lands at this time are not a nation. The German nation state will only come into being in the late 19th century, in 1871. So the German lands, meanwhile, are a patchwork of independent principalities, city-states, duchies, and kingdoms, disunited and quarreling, only held together by a shared language and culture. And in exactly that respect, the Germans of the time felt a marked spiritual kinship to the Greeks. When we think back to ancient Greek city-states who all share a pan-Hellenic identity, pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, pan-Hellenic cultural institutions such as the Olympic Games, and yet finding each other at war with each other quite often, and taking huge efforts to unite only in the face of really pronounced external threats, such as the Persian War. So what does that mean for the 18th century in France and Germany? Well, we get a dual alignment. France aligns itself with Rome, with Latin culture, Latin language and literature, and with the Roman imperial sense of self. Germany, on the other hand, looks towards Greece, thinks of itself as independent, disunited maybe, but cultured, and cultured in a particular way. The Germans will look to Greece and think of themselves as spiritually akin by way of being cultured in an original, authentic way, in a natural way. And they will contrast this with the French and their tendency to focus on Rome, and looking at both France and Rome as derivative, as imitative cultures, as being shallow. So much as the Romans have imitated the Greeks, the French are cast as merely imitating the Romans, whereas the Germans think of themselves, as of the Greeks, as original creators of new culture. This is a line of thought we find developing in a thinker such as Johann Gottfried Herder, a Lutheran pastor. So the context of the training instituted by the Lutheran Reformation certainly has a role to play here. As a Lutheran pastor, he's professionally trained in Greek as well as in other ancient languages, and he is a key figure in developing these thoughts about Greek originality, Greek authenticity, and a search for something similar on the German side. With Johann Gottfried Herder, we get the idea of a spirit of the nation, a spirit that he sees encapsulated in Homer on the Greek side, and a spirit that on the German side now a frantic search begins for. Which author might be the German Homer? And shouldn't there be one yet, this raises the tantalizing possibility that maybe now is the time for someone to capture the genuine spirit of the German people in a way that Homer was thought to have done for the Greeks. So this would be the wider cultural political context out of which 18th century German Philhellenism then arises and really gains momentum. But we can't really get there without looking at another singular figure who turned out to be key for the meteoric rise of Philhellenism in Germany, and that figure is Johann Joachim Winkelmann. In terms of his profession, he was what we would perhaps call today an art historian or an archaeologist, and in fact he is sometimes seen as the founding father of modern archaeology, and he certainly can claim the same prominent role for German Philhellenism. In his evaluation of Greek art, and statuary in particular, he not only first articulated a clear difference between Greek art, Greco-Roman art, and Roman art, he also championed the Greeks as the supreme model in both art and life. His key slogan was edle Einfalt, stille Größe, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. With these words, he captured a new idealized vision of ancient Greek life and culture, captured in art, in statues, and in writing. And the desire to become and to create and to approximate something resembling this became key fuel for the engine of German Philhellenism. A good text where we can see these dynamics in action would be Goethe's novel Die Leiden des jungen Werther, The Sufferings of Young Werther, a bestseller of the 18th century, which spread like a wildfire across Europe, the story of a young man impossibly in love and in the end committing suicide. So not just a literary sensation, it also sparked a suicide wave across Europe. But the key thing for thinking about Philhellenism and German Philhellenism at that is Werther's reading material. When we encounter Werther, he studies Homer. He's a young man who goes out into nature, who's trying to live a new life for himself, and he is immersing himself in the study of Homer. We see here a marker for a change in priority of who is the big epic writer and thinker. Virgil's star is steadily declining in Germany, whereas Homer's star is on the rise. And another scene from The Sufferings of Young Werther comes to mind, when our protagonist first falls madly in love with the beloved that is already belonging to another. They stand in the countryside, they're in a forest, they were out for a dance, and the festivities were interrupted by a major storm, a great outpouring of rain. And as the quiet settles in after the storm, his beloved Lotte turns to him and whispers, Klopstock. And with that, his heart melts. What is Klopstock all about? Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock is a poet, and he was one of the first poets to introduce Greek meters into German. He is perhaps the key poet who opened up German literature to models other than those that came in from France, so trying to bring German literature out of the orbit of imperial France and giving Germany its own way of doing poetry, by way of bringing Greek meters into German poetry. And in doing so, he paved the way for Johann Heinrich Vosse's translation of Homer's Odyssey into German and into German hexameters, so carrying the Greek meter into German. So this not only enchanted Goethe's young Werther as he fell in love with Lotte, who made this connection of this particular moment in nature, this deeply felt emotion, and the poet Klopstock, it also set the German literary scene on fire, writing in a Greek way, adopting Greek meters, trying to capture the Greek spirit, and now becomes the key way for authors to write. Another key poem we might look at here is Friedrich Schiller's poem Die Götter Griechenlands, The Gods of Greece of 1788. It could be seen as something like an early programmatic statement of German Philhellenism. In this poem, Schiller describes what he conceives to be the conception of life and nature in antiquity, a world that is populated with imagination, where behind every tree and fountain a deity and a whole myth lurks, as a harmonious and happy age. And he contrasts that sharply with his own age, characterized by a stale Christianity, an age of loss, of alienation, of joylessness and divisiveness. So Greece emerges as a counter-modernity, as an antidote to modernity as it is experienced, and as a vehicle for a new perspective onto the world and a place of longing. As I've already indicated, all of this is connected to the process of Germany becoming a nation, which is gaining momentum as we move from the 18th into the 19th century. And though it may be difficult for us to imagine, the production of literature was really key for this process of nation building. So when Wilhelm von Humboldt pays homage to Klopstock and Voss's achievement in their translations of Greek meters into German meters, he has the following to say, and he says it in his own preface to a translation he prepared of Aeschylus' tragedy Agamemnon, published in 1816. So here's what he writes, quote, "Words fail to express how much the German nation owes to Klopstock with his first treatment of antique meters, and how much more it owes to Voss, who may be said to have introduced classical antiquity into the German language. A more powerful and beneficial national culture can hardly be imagined in an already highly sophisticated time, and that is his influence alone." So you see, the nation-building process is envisaged here as one that draws on resources provided by Greece and that facilitate Germany to really develop as a cultured, civilized nation of its own making, and not one that is under the cultural hegemony of another contemporary power. Wilhelm von Humboldt is an interesting and important figure for German Philhellenism as large. He not only prepared his own metrical translation of the Agamemnon, which in itself is astonishing. It's very close to the poetic diction, the syntax, and the imagery of the Greek original, so much so that it really marks a decisive break with the French neoclassical modes of translation, which always sought to clean up the original, to familiarize it, and to make it fit the neoclassical standards of neat, rational, orderly poetry. His Agamemnon is raw, is wild, and really brings German syntax to its limits and making it read very Greek. The same Humboldt not only prepared this translation, he also led educational reform, and in particular university reform in Prussia. So Wilhelm von Humboldt is himself a passionate Philhellene and was acquainted with all the leading classicists and classicizing poets of his time. And for a very brief term, it's just a matter of months really, we're talking about February 1809 to July 1910, he was in charge of the Prussian Interior Ministry section for educational and ecclesiastical affairs. And in that short period, he transformed Prussia's education system with enormous consequences. He implemented the Abitur, which is a school-leaving exam which from then on became the exclusive entry qualification for university attendance. He did this for Prussia, but other German states quickly followed suit and implemented similar structures. So classical language learning now became a firm requisite for any kind of higher education. In other words, there was no one in any institution of higher learning who was unable to read Plato or Homer and had done so for years. This is then the trajectory, the institutional trajectory, how Philhellenism spreads and gets a hold of the population, the cultural imaginary at large. And what happens on the side of language and literature also happens on the side of art. Ever since Winkelmann, we see a rise in collections of ancient art and ancient statues, copies most of the time, but again, because of the disunited state of the German lands, every principality, kingdom, and free city tries to have their own collection of antiques. So there is a widespread exposure to Greek culture and a widespread familiarization with Greek culture through new German writing that looks to Greece as a model. A little bit later in time, we see another important connection, which is where German Philhellenism and German Romanticism kiss and meet. And the key figure here is Friedrich Hölderlin, who studied in this Tübinger Stift, this Reformation foundation that became an important educational center in Germany. So Friedrich Hölderlin is a key figure in German Romanticism, as well as a burning Philhellene. He translates Sophocles and Pindar's works in a powerful poetic language that really brings what German can do as a language to and beyond its breaking point, and will inspire poets and thinkers for centuries to come. What we should point out here, however, is that this German Philhellenism is much in keeping with German idealism at the period, something that happens in the mind, in the imagination. In Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's play Iphigenia of Tauris, Iphigenia among the Taurians, we find the very, very programmatic and telling line describing her as das Land der Griechen mit der Seele suchend, seeking out, searching for the land of the Greeks with her soul, with the soul. This is what German Philhellenism does. It longs for the land of the Greeks, and it seeks it out with the soul, with the imagination, with nostalgia. This isn't about actually traveling to Greece. This isn't about engaging with contemporary Greeks. It's about longing to be in this Greek utopia of the mind, this nostalgic past. It's about reimagining it, recreating it. So much like Johann Winkelmann, with his very lively and sensual descriptions of what were really fragmented torsos and fragments of statues, brought them to new life, making them capable to transport the reader to the world of ancient Greece through his imaginative completion of those statues in his writing about them, transporting the reader to a different world where these statues were whole, intact, and part of a daily life. So the writers of German Philhellenism seek the land of the Greeks with their souls and take the readers with them. The actual Greece and the Greek population of the time is really of little concern. So German Philhellenism, especially in the form of Weimar classicism, which is named, by the way, after the city of Weimar, where a lot of the key players were resident at the time. German Philhellenism in its Weimar classicism form then consists of a synthesis of a new type of classicism forged as an act of distancing oneself against French neoclassicism, a synthesis of this new classicism with romanticism and also some ideas that linger from the Age of Enlightenment. And at the same time, Philhellenism shapes German Romanticism and German Classicism in its own way. So it's a diverse process that we see here. When and how does German Philhellenism end? Well, that too is a tricky question. One possible candidate for a turning point could be said to be when Kaiser Wilhelm II addressed the December School Conference in 1890 with the following words. I'll translate this for you into English. What is lacking most of all is the national basis. For the foundation of German higher schooling, we need to take what is German. Wir sollen nationale junge Deutsche erziehen und nicht junge Griechen und Römer. We must educate young national Germans and not young Greeks and Romans. We must make German the basis of education. You could see how the tide is turning here and how institutionalized Philhellenism from that moment on is pushed back with a stronger focus on German literature and culture. So from then on, we have a gradual erosion and decline of Greek and Latin in school curricula and as requirements for access to higher education, which again leads to their decline of value and prominence in society as a large. However, the legacy of German Philhellenism, and especially its expression in Weimar classicism, continued and continues to this day to be a touchstone of German literature and culture, and with it, the turn to Greece. We might also think here of the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who is a contemporary of Kaiser Wilhelm II, where we have this turning point. And again, Nietzsche is grounded in his whole thinking in his own engagement with Greek literature and thought. And among other things, he offers a powerful rejection of and alternative to this white marble Philhellenism that Winkelmann had championed and that had triggered Weimar classicism. So this cleaned up, rational, idealized Greece of Weimar is rejected by a thinker like Friedrich Nietzsche, again with enormous consequences. Further down the line, a philosopher like Martin Heidegger would continue with this notion of a deep-rooted affinity between the Greeks and the Germans, and captured in his famous dictum, Philosophieren kann man ohnehin nur auf Deutsch und Griechisch. You can basically do philosophy only really in Greek and German. Nazi Germany, again and again, looks to Sparta as a model for education the German youth into a disciplined martial society. And it also seeks to substantiate a biological connection in racial terms, again between ancient Greeks and ancient Germans, this time through the Dorians and their supposed migration from the Germanic north into Hellas. Later in history, Eastern German writers writing under communism, such as Christa Wolf, will continue to draw on Greek myth and figures from Greek myth, in her case, those of Medea and Cassandra, to explore their position under communist rule. And today's contemporary German writers, such as the novelist Bernhard Schlink, with his novel Die Heimkehr, Homecoming, or the poet Barbara Köhler in her poem Niemandsfrau, Nobody's Woman, return and rewrite, once again, Homer's Odyssey. Still, it is fair to say that the peak of German Philhellenism in the late 18th and early 19th century really does mark the high point of Germany's obsession with Greece. And classical German literature, and indeed the cultural process of Germany's becoming a nation, are unthinkable without this passionate, longing gaze to an imagined Greek past that could provide the resources for a new German future, or else nurse the feelings of nostalgia and unbelonging shared by so many at the time. A tyranny of Greece over Germany it might have been, but perhaps a tyranny closer to that of Pericles and classical Athens, in that it did give birth to a classical age in German literature and culture.